One factor that is extremely important in looking back on the history of the Mormon Church is transparency and maintaining an objective understanding of what actually took place, regardless if it is easy to accept or not. As an example, if the plates were not technically used in the translation process, why does the LDS Church still have numerous pictures depicting an event that did not take place? All in all, I believe that a lot of Mormons want transparency and an accurate representation of the historical events as they actually happen, not a whitewashed version. In this video, we will tell a true story about the Book of Mormon that is very different from the story that is being told by Mormon missionaries or taught by the Mormon leadership. The Book of Mormon was not translated using the Urim and Thummim. This term was only associated with the spectacles after 1833. The image of Joseph Smith sitting behind the curtain, wearing the breastplate and spectacles, is anachronistic to the 1828 and 1829 setting. None of the eyewitnesses mention the breastplate, or Smith attaching the spectacles to a breastplate. Nowhere does the Book of Mormon associate the interpreters or spectacles with a breastplate. It was for obvious apologetic reasons that this magical instrument began to be associated with the Old Testament's Urim and Thummim, which were two stones in Aaron's breastplate. While there was no attempt to claim the instrument buried with the plates was the same as the one used by ancient Jewish high priests, the purpose of making such an association was to obscure the occult or folk magic connection with seer stones. In the Book of Commandments, which was the original edition of the Doctrines and Covenants, the Urim and Thummim was not mentioned. It was added later in the Doctrines and Covenants. Compare the Revelation with chapter 9 in the Book of Commandments with Doctrines and Covenants section 10, verse 1. The Urim and Thummim is not mentioned in the Book of Mormon either. Moreover, in the first edition of the Book of Mormon, published in 1830, there is no section with the testimony of the prophet Joseph Smith. Let's have a quick look at the contents of the 1830 edition. The Book of Mormon has a title page and a copyright page. The following 2 pages of the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon is the preface, written by the author Joseph Smith. The Book of Mormon starts on page 5, with the first book of Nephi, and ends with the Book of Moroni, on page 588. The testimony of the 3 witnesses and also the testimony of the 8 witnesses can be found on pages 589 and 590, respectively. It's important to repeat that the testimony of Joseph Smith was not included in the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. One would reasonably assume that the Urim and Thummim or interpreters, which are described as 2 stones in silver bows, buried together with the plates, was intended to translate the Book of Mormon. This term was not mentioned in the Book of Mormon, and was not part of the original revelations as written down in the Book of Commandments. A peep stone or seer stone, used by Joseph Smith to locate subterranean treasure, was used to translate the Book of Mormon as we know it today. This seer stone was not deposited with the plates and was not prepared by God for the purpose of translating the plates. It's obvious that Joseph Smith had to hide the fact that the Book of Mormon was translated using a stone in a hat. The true story that is relevant to the Book of Mormon translation starts in 1820. The important historical events leading up to the translation of the Book of Mormon are shown here. Joseph Smith's time as a money digger or treasure seeker is incredibly important to understanding the Book of Mormon. It begins with Joseph Smith's time as a treasure or money digger in the years leading up to the recovery of the gold plates and translation of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith and his family were hired by farmers and landowners to locate buried treasure and break the enchantments that guarded the treasure. The Smith family and other treasure seekers believed that enchantments on buried treasure had the power to move the location of the treasure under the earth, so that those seeking the hidden valuables could not acquire them. The concept of slippery treasure is mentioned in the Book of Mormon, in Helaman 13 verse 31, where Samuel the Lamanite warns the Nephites that their riches will become slippery, and they will not be able to hold them. Joseph Smith moved with his family from Vermont to western New York in the year 1818. They first settled in Palmyra Village and rented a house for 2 years. In 1820, Joseph Smith Sr. purchased a 100-acre farm, a few miles south of Palmyra in Manchester Township. The inauguration of Joseph Jr.'s treasure seeing and digging took place in the spring of 1820 on a then Forest Hill, a short distance from his father's house. Reference: Pomeroy Tucker in his book, Origin, Rise, and Progress of Mormonism. Pomeroy Tucker points out in his book that the imposture was renewed and repeated at frequent intervals from 1820 to 1827, various localities being the scenes of these delusive searches for money, as pointed out by the revelations of the magic stone. In the spring of 1820, Joseph Smith raised some small contributions from the people in the vicinity to defray the expense of digging for the buried money, the precise hiding place of which he had discovered by the aid of the stone in his hat. At an appointed time, being at a dead hour of night, his dupes and employed laborers repaired with lanterns to the revealed locality of the treasure, which was upon the then Forest Hill, a short distance from his father's house, and after some preparatory mystic ceremonies, the work of digging began at his signal. Silence, as the condition of success, had been enjoined upon the chosen few present, who were to be sharers in the expected prize. The excavating process was continued for some 2 hours, without a word being spoken, the magician meanwhile indicating, by some sort of a wand in his hand, the exact spot where the spade was to be crowded into the earth. When, just at the moment the money box was within the seer's grasp, one of the party, being tempted by the devil, spoke. The enchantment was broken, and the treasure vanished. Such was Joe's explanation, and, ridiculous as was the idea, it was apparently satisfactory to his dupes. An important event for the history of the Book of Mormon occurred in 1822. In that year, Willard Chase, a neighbor of the Smiths, was engaged in digging a well. He employed Alvin and Joseph Smith to assist him, the latter of whom is now known as the Mormon prophet. After digging about 20 feet below the surface of the earth, they discovered a strange-looking stone that others would describe as dark brown and about the size of a hen's egg. Joseph Smith claimed that he was able to see things in it. Gaining possession of a seer stone, declared genuine by a noted seer, was an important move in Smith's career as a treasure digger. With this seer stone, Joseph Smith built a reputation as a gifted seer. Now that Joseph Smith had a magical seer stone, he started to spread the rumor about another treasure hidden in the Manchester area, gold plates. This was a genius marketing move to increase his money-digging business. Joseph Smith's reputation as a treasure seer was recognized by some Mormon leaders as well. LDS Church historian Stephen Snow notes in the Ensign magazine of September 2015 that by 1825, young Joseph had a reputation in Manchester and Palmyra for his activities as a treasure seer, or someone who used a seer stone to locate gold or other valuable objects buried in the earth. Because of Joseph Smith's reputation as a scryer, Josiah Stoll hired Joseph and his father in November 1825 to dig for a supposed Spanish treasure near Harmony, Pennsylvania. Joseph boarded at the home of Isaac Hale and met Emma Hale. No treasure was found. Joseph Smith said the enchantment was so powerful that he could not see where the treasure was. Joseph Smith's seer stone would get him in trouble in 1826, when he was brought before Judge Albert Neely in Bainbridge, according to the docket entry of March 20, 1826. People of State of New York versus Joseph Smith. In his testimony, Joseph agreed he had used his seer stone to look for lost property. LDS apologist Hugh Nibley, referring to this court record, stated in his book, The Mythmakers, if this court record is authentic, it is the most damning evidence in existence against Joseph Smith. According to Benjamin Franklin, treasure diggers are persons with a vain hope of growing suddenly rich, neglecting their business, almost to ruining of themselves and families, and voluntarily endure abundance of fatigue in a fruitless search after imaginary hidden treasure. At midnight they go to the hopeful spot with spades and pickaxes. Full of expectation they labor violently, trembling at the same time in every joint, for fear of certain malicious demons who are said to haunt and guard such places. In his affidavit, Isaac Hale states that, after these occurrences, young Smith made several visits at my house, and at length asked my consent to his marrying my daughter Emma, which I refused. Not long after this, he returned, and while I was absent from home, carried off my daughter, into the state of New York, where they were married without my approbation or consent. After they had arrived at Palmyra, New York, Emma wrote to me inquiring whether she could have her property. I replied that her property was at her disposal. In August 1827 they returned, bringing with them a Peter Ingersoll. Peter Ingersoll was hired by Joseph Smith Jr., in August 1827, to go to Pennsylvania, to move his wife's household furniture up to Manchester. Here is the testimony from Peter Ingersoll about the events. When we arrived at Mr. Hale's, in Harmony, Pennsylvania, from which place he had taken his wife, a scene presented itself, truly affecting. His father-in-law, Mr. Hale, addressed Joseph, in a flood of tears, "You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to her grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people." Joseph wept, and acknowledged he could not see in a stone now, nor never could, and that his former pretensions in that respect were all false. He then promised to give up his old habits of digging for money and looking into stones. According to the affidavit of Isaac Hale, Joseph Smith stated to his father-in-law that he had given up what he called glass looking, and that he expected to work hard for a living, and was willing to do so. As LDS historian Richard Bushman stated in Laura Hale's book, A Reason for Faith, the guardian spirits of Joseph's treasure-seeking had transmuted in his imagination into the angel Moroni, and buried treasure was transformed into the gold plates. He was working out a pivot in his life, and transitioning from treasure digging to becoming a religious leader. Shortly after Joseph claimed to have obtained the plates, the couple moved back to Emma's hometown of Harmony, Pennsylvania. Joseph and Emma arrived at the Hale farm early in December 1827. They stayed briefly with her parents before moving into a neighboring home of their own. Here, Joseph embarked on the translation of the Book of Mormon, with Emma as his primary help. Let's compare the following contradictions about the translation device. In the Joseph Smith history, that is part of the Pearl of Great Price, we can read the following in verse 35. Also, that there were 2 stones in silver bows, and these stones, fastened to a breastplate, constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim. Deposited with the plates, God had prepared them for the purpose of translating the book. In sharp contrast, we read in the affidavit from Isaac Hale, father-in-law of Joseph Smith, that Joseph's occupation was that of seeing, or pretending to see, by means of a stone placed in a hat. The manner in which Joseph Smith pretended to read and interpret the plates was the same as when he looked for the money diggers using a stone in a hat. In his affidavit, Peter Ingersoll also made an interesting comment, particularly what Joseph Smith told him about the gold plates. Joseph told Peter that he had no such book, referring to the plates, and believed there never was any such book. Let's hear what LDS historian Richard Bushman has to say about the plates. Joseph Smith was not even looking at the gold plates to translate them. All they are is an imaginary object. We can't see them or touch them, but they're in our heads. Gold plates figure in the imagination of modern Mormons. That would make sense, since many witnesses have confirmed that the plates were not present or used during the translation of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith's time as a money digger or treasure seeker is incredibly important to understanding the Book of Mormon. His famous seer stone, discovered in 1822, was used for money digging and was the primary translation instrument for the Book of Mormon. Here are takeaway points from this video. The Urim and Thummim described by Smith was never mentioned in the Book of Mormon, and not mentioned in original revelations, which were published in the 1833 edition of the Book of Commandments. The concept of the Urim and Thummim was added later in Joseph Smith history and the Doctrines and Covenants. None of the eyewitnesses mention the breastplate, or Smith attaching the spectacles to a breastplate. Smith decided to include the breastplate later to make it sound more biblical and credible. The Book of Mormon uses the term interpreters only, and interpreters are nowhere described as a stone in a hat. The seer stone that was used for money digging would not have been a credible translation device in Joseph Smith's era. Smith didn't look at plates during translation. After Smith found his famous seer stone, he spread the rumor of buried gold plates, which is just another hidden treasure. Joseph Smith promised to end his money digging career on request of his father-in-law, when moving with his wife to Harmony, Pennsylvania. The fabrication of the Book of Mormon was the start of his religious career.